He woke to the soft, insistent hum of the city outside his window, a low vibration that seeped through the thin glass into his chest, almost like the room itself was breathing. The sunlight pressed against the edges of the blinds, casting long, trembling stripes across the floor. Each stripe shifted imperceptibly as the morning air stirred, brushing faintly against his skin. He lay for a moment, listening. The distant rumble of a bus, muffled conversations drifting up from the street, the soft, rhythmic clatter of dishes somewhere below, each sound grounded him in the familiar, the ordinary, the safe. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and felt the cool, slightly textured surface of the carpet under his feet. The smell of brewed coffee lingered faintly, mingling with the subtle scent of sun-warmed furniture. Every sense seemed heightened in the quiet morning. He noticed the way the kettle on the stove reflected the light, a gleam dancing across the metal surface that seemed almost alive. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, folding the blanket with care, aware of the weight of his own motions. Every small, deliberate action, the brushing of a hand along the smooth counter, the careful placement of a mug, was grounding, reassuring. This was how life should feel: ordered, predictable, safe. The refrigerator hummed steadily, the faucet gurgled softly as he filled his cup, and somewhere far off, a door clicked shut. Even as he sipped his coffee, a faint unease pressed at the edges of his awareness, subtle, almost imperceptible. A shadow lingered too long in the corner of his eye. The air shifted suddenly, brushing against his arm, though the window was closed. He dismissed it immediately. Coincidences happened. Shadows stretched oddly, the floor creaked in unusual rhythms, the hum of the fridge felt sharper, but perhaps it was just him noticing, imagining. He settled into his usual rhythm, allowing his mind to drift lazily toward the day ahead. The sunlight warmed his shoulders, the cup warmed his hands. He repeated the small rituals of his morning, each motion deliberate, stirring the coffee, lifting it to his lips, pausing to inhale the aroma, setting it down, adjusting a book on the counter that had slid slightly overnight. All of it was ordinary, reassuringly ordinary, yet beneath the surface, a quiet thread of doubt had begun to weave its way through the familiar fabric of his morning. It was barely noticeable, almost absurd to name. The way the air lingered differently around him, the subtle shift in the sounds outside, the occasional flicker of light that his mind barely registered. He could have ignored it, and perhaps he would, as he had ignored the first signs that sometimes appeared and vanished without consequence. But today, without any outwardly dramatic incident, something had changed. The small, ordinary patterns he trusted so thoroughly had begun to tremble, ever so slightly, like the faintest pulse beneath a calm surface. And yet he drank his coffee, listened to the city, and told himself, as he always had, just a coincidence. The day carried on with its usual weight of sound and movement, but a subtle tension began to weave itself into the rhythm of his life, like a thread pulled just slightly too tight. He noticed it first in the quiet corners of his apartment, a faint creak in the floorboards beneath his feet, a shadow that seemed to hesitate at the edge of the hallway before vanishing. He paused, half expecting it to be nothing, half expecting it to be more. His pulse quickened, though he didn't let it show. He went about his morning chores, but each motion felt slightly heavier than before. The air itself seemed altered, thicker, almost tangible, brushing against the back of his neck in a way that made him shiver despite the warmth of the room. He opened a cupboard to retrieve a mug and noticed the handle was slightly askew, turned just enough to feel deliberate. He shook his head, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow even to him. Of course, it was nothing. He moved to the living room, the familiar layout suddenly feeling strange. The couch cushions sagged differently than he remembered. The sunlight that poured through the window hit the floor in a way that made patterns stretch unnaturally. He sat down slowly, feeling the texture of the fabric beneath his fingers, trying to ground himself in the physical, in the ordinary. Still, something persisted, a faint tremor in the air, a whisper of uncertainty brushing against the edges of his awareness. He tried to distract himself, reaching for the book he had set aside yesterday, but as his hand closed around the cover, he realized the book had been moved. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough to feel deliberate, intentional. He froze, listening. Only the hum of the city outside, distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog. Nothing more. He repeated to himself, coincidence. It had to be. Yet the subtle unease continued to grow, settling like sediment beneath the surface of his thoughts. He noticed the small details he had ignored in the past. The way the fridge hummed slightly differently, the way the ceiling fan's rhythm wavered imperceptibly, the way his own reflection in the window seemed a moment too delayed as he moved past it. Each instance was tiny, almost laughable if he considered it logically, yet together they formed a pattern that he could no longer dismiss entirely. He tried to focus on the sounds of the street, the warmth of the sunlight, the gentle aroma of coffee lingering faintly on the counter. He told himself that nothing was wrong, that he was imagining things, that all of this, the creaks, the shadows, the shifted objects, was simply the natural, unnoticed irregularities of life. And yet, as the hours passed, the subtle thread of unease tightened. He found himself pausing more often, listening for noises he couldn't quite place, glancing toward corners he hadn't noticed before. He moved through his apartment with deliberate caution, touching surfaces more slowly, observing reflections more intently, noting the patterns of light and shadow. Even as he reassured himself, a growing tension lodged in the back of his mind. There was a rhythm to these small anomalies, a cadence that suggested intent without revealing purpose. And the thought, once dismissed, began to whisper, "What if it isn't nothing?" By the time evening approached, the city's hum had shifted into a deeper, low vibration. The sunlight had dulled, replaced by the muted orange glow of streetlights pressing through the blinds. He sat back on the couch, sipping his coffee, noticing how the liquid felt warmer than expected, clinging to the cup in ways that felt deliberate. Every sound, every movement in the room seemed slightly exaggerated, amplified, as if the apartment itself were holding its breath, waiting. And for the first time, he felt a prickling awareness, an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, these tiny, almost imperceptible cracks in his day were not coincidences at all. Evening settled in fully now, carrying a strange weight. The city outside hummed its routine tune, indifferent to the quiet unraveling inside the apartment. He moved to the kitchen, pouring himself another cup of coffee, feeling the warmth through his fingers. The mug seemed heavier than usual, its ceramic surface cool in some spots, almost clammy. He frowned, staring at it longer than necessary, trying to convince himself that this was normal, that he was imagining things. But the little anomalies were no longer small. They repeated, each one tracing the same pattern he had unconsciously started noticing yesterday. The faint creak in the hallway came again as he walked toward the fridge. A shadow lingered in the corner of his vision, though every time he turned, it vanished. The book he had left on the couch earlier was now back on the coffee table, exactly as it had been before, but his mind remembered moving it. He hadn't. A chill brushed across his neck. He rubbed it away, telling himself it was nothing, just the air conditioner kicking in, or maybe the open window letting in a cool draft. Still, every sound seemed amplified, sharper, more deliberate. He listened intently, as if the apartment itself were trying to speak. And perhaps in some way it was. He walked back to the living room, scanning the floor for details he might have missed. The rug was slightly shifted, though he could swear he had straightened it that morning. He crouched, pressing his fingers to the fibers, feeling the texture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make him pause, just a moment too long. He tried to recall when he had last touched it. He couldn't. Sitting back on the couch, he ran his hands over the fabric, thinking about what was happening. Logic offered no explanation. Every rational thought he had, the hum of the city, the air currents, the imperfections of daily life, fought to ground him. But the repetition of the oddities gnawed at his mind. Things happen for a reason, he whispered silently to himself, though he didn't want to believe it. Things happen for a reason. He remembered the times before, small lapses of attention, odd coincidences, moments when he'd felt watched but dismissed it immediately. How many had he missed because he told himself it was nothing? Now, it felt as if the apartment itself were recording these moments, stitching them together into a narrative that he wasn't meant to understand fully yet. He tried to distract himself. He turned on the television, but the static on the screen seemed louder than usual, its pattern vaguely resembling movement. Every sound, from the faucet dripping in the kitchen to the faint hum of the refrigerator, carried an unspoken rhythm, a cadence that suggested intention. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to breathe through the tension, focusing on the air moving across his face, the subtle warmth of the lamp beside him. Still, when he opened them, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if it had contracted just slightly while his eyes were closed. The shadows now held shape longer than before, sometimes seeming to linger at the edge of the furniture, the corners of the walls, even in reflections in the window. He caught himself staring at his own reflection, noticing how it sometimes seemed delayed by a fraction of a second, a twitch in the corner of the eye. Am I imagining this? The thought repeated, but with every second, it felt less like a question and more like a warning. By the time night fully blanketed the city, the apartment had become a careful maze. Every step required conscious attention. Every sound seemed orchestrated. He sat on the edge of the couch, sipping his coffee, hands wrapped around the mug as if it could anchor him. But the feeling of being off balance persisted, a subtle tension weaving into his chest, pulling tight, reminding him that nothing, no coincidence, no shadow, no anomaly, was ever truly harmless. He tried to remember if he had ever felt this before. Perhaps it was just fatigue, he reasoned. Perhaps he was reading too much into small details. But the repetition, the way the anomalies mirrored themselves in patterns, was undeniable. The apartment felt alive, yet not alive. It breathed around him, patient, waiting, observing. And in that observation, he began to sense a rhythm he could not yet name, a sequence he could not yet interpret, but one that had been forming long before he noticed it. And, as he sat quietly, letting the soft hum of the city fill the space around him, the awareness slowly dawned. These were not isolated events. They were connected, and he was at the center. He sat on the edge of the couch, the coffee now lukewarm, its steam long gone, curling faintly into the dim light of the lamp. Every small noise seemed magnified. The refrigerator's hum was sharper, the dripping faucet in the bathroom sounded deliberate. The shadows on the walls shifted ever so slightly, as though testing his awareness, probing his focus. He closed his eyes and tried to take a deep breath, letting the quiet fill him. But the quiet wasn't quiet, it was a space where every detail, every past moment, seemed magnified, replayed, observed. His thoughts turned inward. I must be imagining things. The phrase repeated, almost like a mantra, but it offered no comfort. He remembered the book on the coffee table, the rug slightly shifted, the faint creak in the hallway. These were small things, yet together they formed a rhythm he could not ignore. Every attempt to rationalize, the hum of appliances, the draft through the window, fatigue, felt hollow. Nothing explained the way he had felt observed, the creeping sense that something or someone was quietly orchestrating these moments. He rubbed his temples and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It was a simple apartment ceiling, flat and unremarkable, yet somehow it felt oppressive. He thought about the people in his life, friends, co-workers, strangers he passed on the street. None of them could understand this, and even if he tried to explain, he knew they would dismiss it as imagination. Perhaps he would have dismissed it too, if he hadn't seen it repeat, seen the pattern form like a silent thread weaving through his day. The more he thought, the more a creeping unease settled over him. He realized that he was trying to understand the sequence, the repetition, as if knowing it would provide safety. But safety wasn't the goal. Understanding wasn't enough. The small anomalies, the repeated moments, the subtle distortions, they were warnings. Warnings of what? He wondered. He didn't want the answer, not fully. Yet the question alone made his chest tighten. He got up and began pacing the apartment, slowly, deliberately. His footsteps were soft against the carpet, but each movement seemed to echo in his mind. I should check again, just to be sure, he thought. But check what? The rug, the book, the shadows? Everything? Nothing? He paused mid-step, letting the tension coil inside him, wrapping around his ribs like cold wire. He reached for the window, peering out into the city below. The lights flickered in familiar rhythm. People moved. Cars passed. The world was normal, indifferent, continuing in its mundane flow. And yet he felt trapped. Trapped in the awareness that something in his own apartment was not ordinary. The room felt smaller, tighter. He ran his hands along the walls, feeling the texture of the paint, the smoothness interrupted by tiny imperfections. Every surface was familiar, yet alien. Every corner could conceal a truth he was not ready to face. He sat back down, clasping his hands tightly together. His mind replayed every minor anomaly, every creak, every shadow, every misplaced object. He imagined possibilities, wild and mundane, each one more exhausting than the last. The more he tried to reason, the more the uncertainty expanded. And with that uncertainty came a slow, gnawing panic, the kind that doesn't scream but burrows quietly into your chest, into your bones. Time passed. Minutes blended together. He could not tell if he had been pacing for 5 or 15. The apartment had grown heavier. The walls seemed closer. The shadows seemed to linger longer. He realized he had been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, deliberately. And as he did, a thought struck him, a subtle, almost imperceptible realization. He was no longer alone. Not in the way one imagines being alone with another person. He was alone with himself, but his sense of self had shifted. He began noticing the pattern in his thoughts, the way his doubts circled, the rhythm of internal questioning. It was as if the apartment had become a mirror, reflecting not his body, but his consciousness back to him, warped and amplified. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, willing calm to return. But the mind, once attuned to patterns, does not easily forget them. Every noise, every shadow, every small misalignment became part of a larger tapestry, one he couldn't fully see but could feel pressing against him. He realized he was at a threshold, a quiet boundary between ordinary life and something subtly insidious, something that did not require visible threat to command attention. He wanted to leave. He wanted to escape to the city outside, to the indifferent street. But even that thought carried weight. The world beyond his door might offer distraction, but not understanding. And without understanding, he knew, the thread of unease would follow him. Everywhere. So he stayed. He watched. He listened. Every minor anomaly replayed in his mind, each repetition strengthening the rhythm he could not yet name. The tension was no longer a possibility. It was a constant companion, wrapped around him in the quiet, persistent way of a thought that refuses to leave. And in that persistent observation, he faced the undeniable truth. Understanding might never come. The apartment, the pattern, the anomalies, they demanded attention. And attention, he realized, was not neutral. It was choice. Every moment he considered, every pause he took, carried him further into the rhythm he could neither escape nor fully control. He stood in the hallway, the faint hum of the apartment's ventilation system filling the quiet space. His hands hovered near the light switch, then withdrew, almost instinctively. He knew the door wasn't locked. He had checked it earlier, a habit more than caution, but still, a small, nagging thought pressed at the back of his mind. What if I should check again? He shook his head, trying to dispel it. The thought itself felt heavier than it had any right to. He glanced around the familiar apartment. The living room was as he had left it. The rug slightly askew, the book on the coffee table open to a random page, the lamp casting a soft, golden glow that seemed almost protective in its quiet consistency. He drew a slow breath and allowed himself a small measure of comfort in these ordinary details. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And yet the pause lingered. A quiet hesitation that stretched seconds into minutes. He knew that ignoring it entirely would feel irresponsible, and addressing it directly might give him some measure of control. But there was also the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, the mental fatigue of noticing patterns, of listening to the quiet, of feeling the subtle pressures in the apartment. Sometimes, the simplest action seemed almost impossible because it demanded the focus he no longer had. He walked to the door, his steps slow and deliberate, each footfall measured, soft against the carpet. The doorknob felt cool under his fingers, the texture smooth with faint scratches that caught in the warm lamplight. He thought about the call he had ignored, the book left open, the rug out of place, and the hum of small mechanical appliances, each a minor irregularity, yet together forming an unshakable rhythm. His mind raced through possibilities. It's nothing. I'm overthinking. It's just coincidence. It's just my imagination. He repeated these phrases like a mantra, trying to convince himself. Yet, in the silence between the thoughts, doubt seeped in. What if it's not coincidence? What if it's something I've missed? The question lingered like smoke in the air, intangible but pervasive, curling into every corner of his mind. He hesitated, letting his hand linger on the doorknob, feeling the cool metal against his palm, the faint vibration of the building beneath his feet. There was comfort in routine, in the known. Checking the door, verifying, taking deliberate action. It should be simple. But simplicity had a cost. It required admitting a possibility he didn't want to face, acknowledging that the apartment, so ordinary in its appearance, might conceal something beyond his understanding. He stepped back, inhaling slowly, allowing the air to fill his lungs, feeling the weight of decision settle over him. He could act. He could check. He could open the door fully and confront the moment. But in that pause, the ordinary and the extraordinary merged, and his fatigue, his desire for normalcy, and the persistent, quiet unease weighed more heavily than caution. So he chose inaction. It was subtle, not dramatic, not a rush of fear or a scream. Just a quiet, almost imperceptible decision to leave things as they were, to accept the rhythm he had noticed, to sit with the tension rather than confront it directly. His hand retreated from the doorknob, brushing lightly against the doorframe, and he stepped back into the living room, feeling the familiar carpet beneath his feet. He settled back onto the couch, the soft fabric cool under his palms. The book lay open before him, the lamp still casting gentle shadows across the room. The apartment felt the same, ordinary, untouched. And yet, there was a subtle shift, something almost imperceptible. A quiet acknowledgement that his choice, small and seemingly inconsequential, had set something in motion. He tried to focus on mundane tasks, checking emails, scrolling through his phone, making another cup of coffee, but every small sound, every shift in shadow, felt magnified. His attention lingered on details he had ignored before, the way the floorboards seemed to sigh under weightless steps, the slight creak of the doorframe, the faint vibration in the walls that didn't correspond to any known appliance. Each anomaly, small on its own, gathered together, forming a rhythm he could no longer ignore. And in that rhythm, he felt a presence, not a being, not a shape, but a force of attention, a quiet awareness threading through the apartment alongside him. He told himself it was habit, imagination, tiredness, but deep down, he knew it was something else. Something that required nothing more than his choice to remain passive. The evening stretched on. Time became pliable, elastic. Each tick of the clock was sharper, each shadow darker, each sound more insistent. And yet, outwardly, everything remained perfectly normal. The apartment was unchanged, familiar, safe, or at least it appeared to be. But the weight of the decision he had made pressed against him quietly, inescapably, and he felt the subtle, almost invisible consequences beginning to coil around him like threads in the dark. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, telling himself it was just a pause, a moment of habit, nothing more. And perhaps it was, perhaps it wasn't. Either way, the choice had been made. The rhythm had been acknowledged, and there was no going back. The apartment was silent. Not the kind of silence that fills a room when everything is turned off, but a deeper, heavier silence, the kind that seems to press against your skin, settle into the corners, and linger in the air. He moved slowly from the couch to the kitchen, every step deliberate, feeling the texture of the carpet beneath his feet, the faint chill of the air brushing against his arms. The lamp in the corner flickered, not with electricity, but with the uncertainty of shadows that seemed to stretch and retreat as he passed. He poured himself another cup of coffee, listening to the water drip, the faint hiss of steam rising. He told himself to breathe, to relax, to ground himself in ordinary task. But even as he did, he felt the quiet tension threading through the apartment, settling around him like a weight he could not lift. Each breath became deliberate, conscious. He noticed the small sounds he had ignored before, a floorboard shifting slightly under no weight, the faint hum of the refrigerator vibrating in odd rhythms, the subtle rustle of air that seemed almost like footsteps, though no one moved. He sat down at the table, fingers wrapped around the warmth of the coffee cup. The heat should have been comforting, but it did not reach past the tension curling around his mind. He tried to distract himself, checking his phone, scrolling through emails, looking at the clock, but time had slowed. Each minute stretched long and hollow, each second carrying the weight of expectation. He felt as though the apartment itself were holding its breath, waiting. The realization settled in quietly. The small, seemingly inconsequential choice he had made, to ignore, to do nothing, to step back, had shifted something. He could not see it. There were no signs, no alarms, no sudden event. And yet, he felt it, coiled around him, a quiet inevitability that pressed into his awareness with every passing moment. He looked around the apartment once more. The rug lay where it always had. The book remained open. The lamp cast its soft light. And yet, the familiar space felt different. The ordinary had become uncertain. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. Corners felt deeper, and even the air itself seemed heavier, waiting for something he could not name. He closed his eyes, telling himself it was nothing. Habit, imagination, tiredness. But in the space behind his closed lids, he felt the weight of inaction, the quiet insistence of a consequence without form, without explanation, pressing closer and closer. The apartment did not move, but he felt watched. Not by eyes, not by a being, but by attention, deliberate and patient, threading through the ordinary moments, acknowledging his choice, marking him. Minutes passed. Hours might have too. The coffee cooled, untouched. He did not stir. Movement felt unnecessary, intrusive. He realized he did not know what he was waiting for, or if anything would ever come. The silence had no end, and he understood, in a way that made his chest tighten, that some mistakes do not announce themselves. They settle quietly, invisibly, and reshape everything around you without your notice. He finally stood, the action slow, careful, almost ritualistic. The lamp light shimmered against the wall, shadows dancing just beyond clarity. He walked to the window and looked out. The city continued as always, unaware, unchanging. The ordinary continued without pause, but inside the apartment, he felt the subtle, persistent weight of consequence. It had no sound, no shape, no warning, but it was there. Returning to the couch, he sat and exhaled. His hands rested in his lap, still. There was nothing to do, nowhere to go. The ordinary had swallowed him, but something had shifted within it. Something he could not undo. The apartment remained silent, the shadows unmoving, the clock ticking steadily. The only sound was his own heartbeat, each beat reminding him that the choice had been made, and that it would never be reversed. He closed his eyes, accepting the quiet. The weight did not lessen. There was no revelation, no explanation, no comfort. The decision lingered, like a shadow stretching just beyond the edge of perception. And in that lingering space, he felt the subtle pressure of inevitability, the quiet permanence of inaction, and the truth he could not articulate. Some doors, once passed, cannot be unpassed. And then, finally, he let himself fall into the stillness. No sudden sound, no revelation, just the apartment, unchanged and ordinary, carrying him forward into the quiet consequences of a single choice. And in that silence, he realized something he could not shake, something he could not name, something that would follow him long after the room itself had forgotten his presence. A soft, invisible weight pressing, patient, immutable, and the last thought, before the quiet fully claimed him, lingered and refused to leave. Some mistakes cannot be undone.